The night was deceptively calm, the kind that carried a chill promising nothing but stillness. Yet inside Ethan Gray's penthouse on the 48th floor, tranquility was a luxury that felt miles away. His world, meticulously crafted from ambition, cunning, and a dash of luck, had started to unravel in the most terrifying way. Ethan sat in his sprawling living room, the city skyline glittering behind him like an indifferent audience to his silent dread. His phone was cradled in his hand, and his thumb hovered over Claire's contact for the 50th time that evening. She hadn't called, she hadn't texted, and for Claire, that was unthinkable. It had been hours since she left for a routine visit to her sister's house in the suburbs, a journey she had made countless times before. She had even texted him earlier that day, a sweet, unassuming message that now seemed to taunt him. "Don't work too late tonight. Baby and I miss you already." Now that silence felt suffocating. Claire was 7 months pregnant, their first child together, and Ethan had been obsessively careful about her safety since the moment they found out. She had always teased him about his overprotective tendencies, brushing off his concerns with her signature warmth. But tonight all of those fears seemed justified, amplified by the gnawing anxiety clawing at his chest. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Ethan's instincts had served him well in his ascent from a scrappy, hungry 20-something with nothing but ambition to one of the most powerful men in the city. He was no stranger to risk, and he wasn't prone to panic. But this was different. This was Claire. She wasn't answering. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. Relief surged for a fleeting moment, only to be replaced by a deepening dread. The screen didn't display Claire's name, but an unfamiliar number. Hesitating, he answered, his voice clipped. "Hello?" The silence on the other end was deafening, save for the faint sound of someone breathing. Then a distorted voice spoke, calm, yet menacing. "If you want to see your wife again, stop looking for her." Ethan's heart stopped. He gripped the phone so hard he thought it might crack. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "What do you want?" But the line went dead. Ethan stared at the screen, his pulse thundering in his ears. He called the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again before finally slamming the phone down on the marble countertop. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of possibilities, none of them leading to an answer that made sense. Who could be behind this? His enemies, a competitor, someone looking for ransom? No one outside of his inner circle even knew Claire, let alone had any reason to harm her. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his normally sharp features shadowed with worry. The call had been vague, cryptic, but it had been enough to confirm his worst fears. Claire hadn't just gone missing. She'd been taken. The phone buzzed again, this time with a text. Ethan snatched it up, his breath catching when he saw the words, "Time is running out. Midnight. No police." Attached was a photo that made his blood run cold. It was Claire, bound to a chair in what appeared to be a dimly lit room. Her hands were tied, her expression steely, despite the fear evident in her eyes. The sight of her pregnant belly was a gut punch, a brutal reminder of the stakes. Ethan clenched his jaw, fighting the wave of rage threatening to overtake him. Whoever had done this had made a grave mistake. He was not a man to be toyed with. Claire had always been Ethan's grounding force, the one person who saw through his carefully constructed exterior to the man beneath. When they met 3 years ago, she had been a struggling artist working part-time in a gallery, a far cry from the cutthroat world Ethan inhabited. But there had been something about her, a quiet strength, a sense of wonder that had captivated him. Their love story had been unexpected, even improbable, but it had been real. And now, as Ethan stared at the grainy image of her captivity, he was reminded of everything they had built together, the life they were on the brink of starting, and he was not going to let anyone take that away from him. By the time Marcus, Ethan's head of security, arrived at the penthouse, Ethan had already replayed the call and analyzed the text a dozen times. Marcus was a seasoned professional, a man who had worked with Ethan for years and seen him navigate countless crises. But this was personal, and even Marcus seemed unnerved by the situation. "Do we have any leads?" Ethan asked, his tone cold and clipped. Marcus shook his head. "We've traced the number, but it's a burner phone. Whoever's behind this knows what they're doing." Ethan's fist clenched at his side. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. "I need you to find them, now." "We're working on it," Marcus assured him. "But Ethan, you need to consider—" "I don't need to consider anything. Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "Claire is out there and she needs me. I don't care what it takes. Find her." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "Understood." As Marcus left to coordinate the search, Ethan sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The hours ticked by, each second a reminder of the midnight deadline looming over him like a storm cloud. Claire sat in the dimly lit room, her wrists sore from the ropes binding them. She tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help her now. Her captors had been careful to keep their identities hidden, wearing masks and speaking in clipped, impersonal tones. But Claire was observant, and she had noticed details. The way one of them walked with a slight limp, the scent of cigarette smoke clinging to another's clothes. Little clues that might mean nothing now, but could prove useful later. The room itself was bare, with concrete walls and a single flickering light bulb overhead. There were no windows, no visible landmarks. Whoever had planned this had gone to great lengths to ensure she couldn't identify her location. Despite the fear gnawing at her, Claire refused to let it consume her. She thought about Ethan, about the life they were supposed to be building together. She thought about the baby, and she thought about the last thing one of her captors had said to her. "Do you even know who your husband really is?" The words had been laced with malice, meant to unnerve her, but Claire had dismissed them. Ethan wasn't perfect, far from it. He was guarded, secretive at times. But she knew him, the real him, in a way no one else did, and she trusted him. Still, the question lingered in the back of her mind, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. As midnight approached, Ethan's phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a voice message. His heart pounded as he played it, his breath catching at the sound of Claire's voice. "Ethan," she began, her tone shaking but steady. "Stop. Don't come for me. There's something you need to know." The message ended abruptly, leaving Ethan staring at the phone, his mind racing. What could she mean? What was she trying to tell him? Outside, the city lights glittered on, oblivious to the storm brewing in Ethan's world. Time was running out, and the answers he sought felt just out of reach. Ethan replayed Claire's voice message at least a dozen times, hoping to extract some hidden meaning from her words. Each time her trembling voice sent a pang through his chest, but the abrupt ending left more questions than answers. What did she mean by, "There's something you need to know"? And why would she urge him to stop looking for her? Stopping wasn't an option. He wouldn't abandon her, not now, not ever. Marcus's team had finally traced a weak lead. The photo of Claire had been taken inside a concrete bunker, likely on the outskirts of the city. Marcus suspected an abandoned industrial site near the docks, a place notorious for its maze-like warehouses and reputation as a criminal hotspot. But there was still no clear motive, no demand for ransom, no indication of what these people wanted from him. That absence of clarity gnawed at Ethan, even as his determination hardened. "I'm going there," Ethan said, rising from his chair and grabbing his coat. Marcus blocked his path, his imposing frame almost as unyielding as his tone. "Ethan, I can't let you walk into this without knowing what we're up against. Let me take the lead." "She's my wife," Ethan snapped, his voice reverberating through the room. "I'm not sitting here while Claire and my child are in danger." Marcus sighed, his resolve softening. "I get it, but these people know how to play mind games. They've been one step ahead since the beginning. Rushing in blind could make things worse, for her and for you." Ethan's jaw tightened, the logical part of him knowing Marcus was right, but logic had no place in the storm of emotions coursing through him. "Then give me something to work with," he growled. "I need more than guesses." Marcus gestured to the tablet in his hand, where he'd been compiling the limited evidence they had. "I ran background checks on every enemy, competitor, and disgruntled ex-employee you've made over the years. Let's just say the list is long." Ethan wasn't surprised. In his climb to the top, he'd stepped on plenty of toes. He wasn't proud of everything he'd done, but he'd rationalized it as the cost of success. Now he wondered if one of those debts had come due. "I also had my tech team analyze the voice on that first call," Marcus continued. "It's distorted, but we think it's a woman. No matches yet, but we're running it through additional filters." Ethan's brow furrowed. A woman? He couldn't think of anyone who fit that profile. Most of his adversaries had been men, ruthless, power-hungry men who viewed him as either a threat or an obstacle. But if this was personal, it had to be someone with a deeper grudge. His thoughts drifted to Claire's last words. "There's something you need to know." Could she have been trying to warn him about his own past? The possibility sent a chill down his spine. Was this about him, or was there something about Claire he didn't know? Claire stared at the flickering bulb above her, the rhythmic hum of electricity the only sound in the room. Hours had passed since her captors last checked on her, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her fears. The woman who seemed to be in charge had returned earlier, delivering cryptic comments meant to unsettle her. "You're braver than I expected," she had said, almost with a smirk. But bravery only gets you so far. Claire had asked what they wanted, why they were doing this, but the woman had only laughed. "You'll see soon enough." Claire clenched her fists, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on her resilience, but this situation was testing her limits. She wasn't just fighting for herself now, she was fighting for her baby. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, had to be calculated. One wrong move could have consequences she couldn't bear to imagine. Despite the fear, she refused to let her captors see her break. They wanted her to be a pawn, a tool to manipulate Ethan. But Claire wasn't the type to sit back and wait to be rescued. She scanned the room again, looking for anything that could help her escape. The chair she was bound to was sturdy but old, the ropes tight but frayed in some spots. She began to twist her wrists, ignoring the sting as the fibers bit into her skin. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to Ethan. She knew he would be doing everything in his power to find her, but she also worried about what he might uncover in the process. Their relationship had been built on love, but there were parts of Ethan's life he rarely spoke about. He had secrets, dark ones, and Claire had always chosen to trust him rather than pry. Now she wondered if those secrets were the reason she was here. Ethan's car sped toward the docks, the city lights fading into the distance. Marcus had tried to dissuade him, but Ethan's patience had run out. He couldn't sit idle while Claire was out there, alone and vulnerable. The docks were eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling stillness. Ethan parked his car a block away and approached on foot, his senses on high alert. Marcus had insisted on sending backup, but Ethan had refused. He didn't trust anyone else with Claire's safety. As he neared the warehouse, he noticed a faint light emanating from one of the windows. His heart pounded as he crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, surveying the area. The building looked abandoned, its walls covered in graffiti and its roof sagging in places. But the light told him someone was inside. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over Marcus's number. He hated to admit it, but he needed support. Before he could make the call, his phone buzzed with another text. "You're closer than you think. But are you ready for the truth?" Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. The cryptic message was infuriating, but it also confirmed he was in the right place. Whoever had sent it was watching him, which meant Claire couldn't be far. Inside the warehouse, Claire had managed to loosen the ropes around her wrists. Her fingers were numb, her skin raw, but she didn't stop. Freedom was within reach, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Her captors had left her alone again, confident she wouldn't try anything. But Claire was nothing, if not resourceful. She waited for the faint sound of footsteps to fade completely before pulling her hands free. The ropes fell to the floor with a muffled thud, and Claire wasted no time untying her ankles. Her heart raced as she stood, every muscle in her body tense. The room had no windows, but there was a door on the far side slightly ajar. She crept toward it, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete. Every step felt like a gamble, each creak of the floorboards threatening to give her away. When she reached the door, she peered through the crack, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, lined with more doors. She had no idea which way to go, but standing still wasn't an option. Steeling herself, she slipped into the hall and began to move. Ethan entered the warehouse cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow. The faint glow from a nearby room caught his attention, and he moved toward it, his footsteps silent. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. He was close. He could feel it. As he approached the door, he heard muffled voices. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but one of the voices was unmistakable. Claire. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. The other voice was sharper, colder. It belonged to the woman from the phone call. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, listening intently. The woman was saying something about truth and consequences, her tone laced with malice. Ethan's fists clenched as he imagined Claire enduring this torment. He couldn't wait any longer. He pushed the door open and froze. Ethan's heart stopped for a brief moment, as the door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. The scene was a cruel tableau that etched itself into his mind. Claire sat in the corner, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. Her face lit up with hope when she saw him, but that hope was quickly extinguished by the sharp, mocking voice that cut through the air. "Well, well, look who decided to join us," said the woman in the center of the room. She turned slowly to face him, her silhouette sharp against the faint light filtering through the cracked window. Ethan's sharp eyes took in every detail of her, her angular features partially obscured by the hood of her coat, her gloved hands resting casually on the back of a chair. She radiated confidence, as if she were holding all the cards in this sick game. "I see you didn't bring the cavalry," she continued, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Good. I hate when things get messy." Ethan stepped fully into the room, his jaw clenched and his gaze flickering briefly to Claire. "Let her go," he said, his voice low and controlled, though every muscle in his body screamed for action. "Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Just let her go." The woman tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about money, Ethan. It's about something far more valuable." Ethan's brow furrowed, his mind racing. If not money, then what? Revenge? Power? His eyes narrowed on the woman as he pressed, "Then what do you want?" She laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "Answers," she said simply, "and I think it's time we both got them." Claire watched the exchange with growing unease. She had hoped Ethan's arrival would mark the end of this nightmare, but the tension in the room told her otherwise. Her captor, the woman who had seemed untouchable since the moment she'd been taken, was now focused entirely on Ethan. It was as if Claire had become secondary, a mere spectator in a confrontation that felt years in the making. "Ethan," Claire said softly, her voice cutting through the charged air. "Don't let her manipulate you." The woman's smirk widened. "Manipulate? Oh, Claire, I'm not manipulating anyone. I'm just here to give your husband a little clarity." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "If this is about me, leave her out of it." "Ah, but she's already in it," the woman said, her tone almost playful. "She's in it because of you, because of the choices you've made." Ethan's mind reeled. He had spent his life compartmentalizing, drawing strict lines between his business dealings and his personal life, but now those lines were blurring, and the fallout was standing before him, cloaked in menace. "I'm done with your games," he said, his voice sharp. "Tell me what you want, or I'll—" "You'll what?" the woman interrupted, her tone hardening. "You think you can buy your way out of this like you've done with everything else? No, Ethan. This isn't about your money. This is about the truth about who you are." Ethan's mind raced as the woman's words hung in the air. There were things in his past, decisions he wasn't proud of, actions he'd taken in the name of survival and success. But he had buried those things deep, convincing himself that they were necessary sacrifices, the cost of building an empire. Now, those buried secrets were clawing their way to the surface. The woman took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Do you remember Malcolm Vance?" The name hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard it in years, but the memories came rushing back with brutal clarity. Malcolm had been one of his earliest competitors, a tech innovator with a promising startup that had posed a threat to Ethan's burgeoning empire. They had clashed in the corporate arena, their rivalry growing increasingly hostile, and then one day, Malcolm had vanished. Ethan had always assumed Malcolm's disappearance was a coincidence, a product of the man's own reckless ambition. But now, standing in this room, with this woman staring daggers at him, he realized it had been far from coincidental. "What does Malcolm have to do with this?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "Everything," the woman spat. "He was my brother." The revelation hit like a thunderclap, the weight of it sinking into Ethan's chest. He stared at the woman, his mind struggling to reconcile the connection. Malcolm had never mentioned a sister, had never mentioned any family for that matter. But the anger in her eyes, the raw emotion in her voice, left no room for doubt. "I didn't," Ethan began, but she cut him off. "You didn't what? Didn't know? Didn't care? You destroyed him, Ethan. You ruined his career, his reputation, his life, and when he tried to fight back, you crushed him." Ethan shook his head, his voice rising. "That's not true. I didn't—" "Don't lie to me," she screamed, her composure cracking for the first time. "You may not have pulled the trigger, but you orchestrated everything. You made sure he couldn't recover, couldn't rebuild. You left him with nothing." Claire's heart sank as she watched the exchange. She had always known Ethan was ruthless in business, but hearing the accusation laid out so starkly made her question everything. Was this the truth he had been hiding? Was this what had put them in this nightmare? Malcolm didn't disappear, the woman continued, her voice trembling with fury. He took his own life, and it's your fault. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. Ethan's chest tightened, his mind reeling. He had never meant for things to go that far. He had played the game, yes, but he had always assumed Malcolm would recover, that he would find another way. He hadn't known, hadn't wanted to know, what his actions had cost. As the tension reached its breaking point, a sudden noise broke through the silence, a faint creak followed by hurried footsteps. All heads turned toward the sound, and before anyone could react, Marcus burst into the room, flanked by two of his men. "Step away from him," Marcus commanded, his voice firm as he trained his weapon on the woman. She laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the small space. "Oh, so the cavalry did show up. How predictable." "Let her go," Marcus ordered, his gaze flickering to Claire. The woman raised her hands in mock surrender, but her smirk remained. "Fine, you win. Take your wife and run back to your glass tower. But this isn't over, Ethan. You'll never escape what you've done." Before Marcus or his men could move, the woman threw a small device to the ground. A deafening pop echoed through the room, followed by a cloud of thick, acrid smoke. Ethan coughed, his eyes stinging as he stumbled toward Claire. "Ethan!" Claire cried, reaching for him as the chaos unfolded. Marcus's voice cut through the fog. "We've got her! Move!" Ethan didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed Claire's hand and pulled her toward the door, his grip firm as they navigated the smoke-filled hallways. His only focus was on getting her out, on keeping her safe. They burst into the cold night air, the sounds of shouting and sirens fading behind them. Ethan held Claire close, his heart pounding as he checked her over for injuries. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm fine. The baby's fine." Relief flooded through him, but it was tempered by the storm brewing in his mind. The woman's words echoed in his ears, her accusations cutting deeper than any knife. He had Claire back, but at what cost? The truth he had worked so hard to bury was now threatening to destroy everything. As the sound of approaching police cars grew louder, Ethan knew this was far from over. The woman had escaped, but her mission was clear: to expose him, to make him pay for his sins. And as he held Claire in his arms, he realized he might not be able to stop her. Ethan sat silently in the back seat of Marcus's black SUV, his hand clasped tightly around Claire's. The vehicle weaved through the city streets, its tinted windows shielding them from prying eyes. The adrenaline that had kept him moving through the chaos of the warehouse was fading, replaced by an oppressive exhaustion. But his mind refused to rest. Claire leaned against him, her breath steady but her grip firm. She hadn't said much since they escaped. Ethan could sense her fear, her unease. She had always been his anchor, the one person who saw him as more than the cold, calculating businessman the world believed him to be. And now that perception was in danger. The accusations leveled against him in that room threatened to tear apart the life they had built together. "Claire," he began, his voice low and hesitant, "what she said back there, about Malcolm, it's not as simple as it sounded." Claire's gaze shifted to him, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Then tell me, Ethan, because right now I don't know what to believe." Ethan inhaled deeply, his mind flashing back to the years he had spent clawing his way to the top. Malcolm Vance had been a formidable competitor, a man with a vision that rivaled Ethan's. Their rivalry had been bitter, with each trying to outmaneuver the other in the high-stakes world of tech innovation. Ethan had played the game ruthlessly, using every tool at his disposal to gain the upper hand. But he had never imagined it would lead to Malcolm's downfall, and certainly not his death. "I didn't know he was struggling," Ethan admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought he'd recover, find another opportunity. I didn't know he would end things." Claire's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained guarded. "Ethan, you've always been driven, but did you ever stop to think about the consequences of your actions? The people you hurt along the way?" Her words cut deeper than he expected, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. He had always justified his decisions as necessary sacrifices, convincing himself that the ends justified the means. Now, faced with the fallout, he wasn't so sure. Before he could respond, Marcus interrupted. "We're here." The SUV pulled into the underground garage of Ethan's private estate, the heavy security gates closing behind them. Marcus exited first, scanning the area before motioning for Ethan and Claire to follow. They stepped into the elevator, the tension between them palpable. As the elevator ascended, Ethan turned to Marcus. "Did you catch her?" Marcus shook his head. "She slipped away in the chaos. But we'll find her, Ethan. She won't get far." Ethan nodded, though his jaw tightened. He didn't doubt Marcus's capabilities, but he knew this wasn't just about finding the woman. It was about facing the truths she had unearthed and the consequences they carried. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in his office, the room dimly lit by the glow of his computer screen. Claire had gone to bed, though their earlier conversation lingered heavily in his mind. He wanted to explain everything, to make her understand. But how could he justify actions he wasn't proud of? He opened a secure folder on his computer, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents, emails, and contracts, evidence of the deals and decisions that had shaped his rise to power. Among them was a file on Malcolm Vance. Ethan hesitated, his cursor hovering over the file name. Finally, he clicked it open. The contents were a stark reminder of his past. There were records of the smear campaign his team had orchestrated against Malcolm, the strategic partnerships that had siphoned away his funding, the whispered rumors that had tarnished his reputation. Ethan had told himself it was just business, but now it felt like something far more sinister. A sudden knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He turned to see Claire standing in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "We need to talk." Ethan gestured for her to come in, his heart pounding as she took a seat across from him. He braced himself for the conversation he had been dreading. "Claire," he began, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "You have every right to be angry. I've made mistakes, ones I can't take back, but everything I've done was to build a life for us, for our family." Claire studied him, her eyes filled with a mix of love and uncertainty. "Ethan, I know you're not a perfect man. I fell in love with you knowing that. But this, what happened with Malcolm, it's not just a mistake. It's something you have to take responsibility for." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I will. I don't know how yet, but I'll make it right." Claire reached across the desk, taking his hand in hers. "I believe you, but you need to start by being honest, with yourself and with me." The next morning, Ethan called Marcus into his office. The sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the room. Ethan stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the city below. "I need you to find her," Ethan said, his tone resolute. "Not just to stop her, but to hear her out." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's wise?" "She's dangerous, Ethan. She's already proven that." "She's not dangerous," Ethan replied, turning to face him. "She's hurt, and she has every right to be. I need to know the full story. What happened to Malcolm, what role I played. If I'm going to fix this, I need the truth." Marcus hesitated, but eventually nodded. "I'll see what I can do." As Marcus left, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from his past. He was confronting it head-on. It took several days, but Marcus eventually tracked down the woman. Her name was Helena Vance, and she had been living under the radar, using aliases to avoid detection. When Marcus brought her to Ethan's estate, she was visibly wary, her sharp eyes darting around the opulent surroundings. Ethan greeted her in his office, his demeanor calm but firm. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Helena remained standing, her arms crossed. "I didn't come here for pleasantries. Say what you need to say." Ethan nodded, his respect for her candor growing. "I want to apologize," he began, "for what happened to Malcolm, for my role in it. I didn't realize the extent of the damage I caused, but that doesn't excuse my actions." Helena's expression remained guarded. "Words mean nothing, Ethan. Malcolm is still gone. You can't undo that." "I know," Ethan said, his voice heavy with regret, "but I want to help. Not to erase what happened, but to honor him. Tell me what I can do." Helena studied him for a long moment before finally sitting down. "You want to help? Then use your power, your resources, to make sure no one else goes through what Malcolm did. Expose the systems that allow people like you to crush people like him." Ethan nodded, her words igniting a spark of determination within him. "I will. I promise." In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to dismantle the parts of his empire that thrived on exploitation and manipulation. He launched initiatives to support struggling entrepreneurs, creating programs that provided funding and mentorship to those in need. He also publicly acknowledged his past mistakes, a move that shocked the business world but earned him newfound respect. Through it all, Claire stood by his side, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured. They welcomed their baby, a healthy, beautiful boy, into a world Ethan was determined to make better. One evening, as they sat together in the nursery, Ethan held their son in his arms and looked at Claire. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Claire smiled, her eyes shining with love. "You're a good man, Ethan. Flawed but good. And that's enough." Ethan kissed her forehead, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in his life, he felt whole.